Okay. So yesterday we saw an example of a C statement where there is one source of data which is in memory, and as well as the destination is also in memory. So, and we discussed how this is handled in MIPS32 assembly language programming. You need to mention have the base address of the array somehow, and we will see later how the base address is obtained in registers. It is actually kind of automatically obtained through certain mechanisms that the assembler provides. It's not very difficult, as we will see later. So you collect the base address in a register, then you calculate an offset. With the knowledge of the type of the data, it is possible to calculate the offset if you know the index at which you want to access the data. For example, here if we are dealing with integer type elements, each is 4 byte. In that case, the 8th index element would skip 32 bytes from the start. That's why we had an offset of 32 from the base register. The base register is the register that contains the base address of an array or the starting address of an array. Now for the destination and for loading the data, that is fetching the data from memory to register, you use the LW instruction, load word. Similarly, for sending the instruction in the reverse direction from the register to the memory, you use the store word or SW instruction. Okay. And there also you calculate the offset. The mechanism is similar. The syntax is very similar. But you have to remember that the store class of instructions, and there are other stored instructions also, which deal with 1 byte at a time or 1 half word, that is 2 bytes at a time, etc. The stored instructions have their source mentioned on the left. Okay. And all other types of instructions have their destination mentioned on the left in the list of operands. The part you will so very soon learn that there are binary codes corresponding to each of these instructions, unique binary codes. Okay. If the entire instruction will be represented in exactly 32 bits, of which certain number of bits will denote the operation that is going to be performed. For example, LW or add or SW, these are called the opcodes. And the remaining lists is a list of operands. Okay, so this operand is something which you know from your knowledge of programming languages. There are function arguments, there are operands of different operators, etc. Here, the other part is the opcode, which mentions what type of operation you want to do. So registers, of course, are faster to access than memory. We have discussed this in detail in the last class. Operating on memory require load store. Okay, MIPS is called a load store architecture. Okay, this is a technical term. Why is this called a load store architecture? Because the only way to access memory in this architecture is to use load and store instructions. There is no other way to access memory directly. There is no instruction where you can have one of the operands to be memory operand. If that was the case, then this earlier instruction I could have, earlier operation in C, I could have done probably with a lesser number of instructions, right? I did not need to first fetch it in and register in T0, right? But that is not possible. The only way to access memory is through load store instructions, and no arithmetic operation or no other types of operations can access memory directly. Okay. Now, other types of, just as a passing remark, other type of architectures, for example, Intel x86-64 or AMD x86-64, AMD 64, these allow these have instructions where one or more of the operands is you can directly, like it can be one of the operand of an addition can be, I'm just giving an example. One of the operand is a register content, the other operand is a memory content. Okay, this type of things are possible. I mean, you can write one instruction in place of two that we wrote in MIPS, but internally the way they work is exactly similar to how MIPS works. They first fetch the content from the memory to the registers internally, add up the operation, add up the stuff or operate on it, and then maybe store it back to memory or store it back to another register, etc. So the mechanism of their working is exactly similar to the way MIPS works. MIPS makes it explicit that there is no way you can access memory directly other than the load and store instructions. In the other type of instruction sets, that is not explicit. Okay, internally it might be broken up into or handled as to be a combination of multiple instructions. Okay, even in MIPS we will learn something called pseudo instructions, which will show you how the assembler has the capability of breaking up certain hypothetical instructions into multiple real instructions. Okay, why we use the hypothetical instructions? To make our life easy, but actually the MIPS instruction set hardware does not support those instructions directly. The assembler has that knowledge, what is supported and what is not supported. So these pseudo instructions, they take and convert it or translate them into a series of actual instructions with equivalent functionality. Okay, and we will see examples of that. So as we said, the compiler must use registers for variables as much as possible, and you only try to spill to memory for less frequently used variable. You don't want to really send stuff to memory, because sending data to memory goes through the von Neumann bottleneck and it's slow. So this register optimization, register lifetime analysis, that after what after execution of what code some register will be free and it can be reused, this type of analysis is oftentimes included in compilers. Probably you have also learned or you will learn in your class. Now let us come to a next very useful type of instruction, where it is kind of an arithmetic instruction, just that one of the operands is an immediate operand. Okay, what is an immediate operand? An immediate operand is a direct constant value that you can directly mention in the instruction. Say for example, add I $S3 $S34. Note that here the destination register and the one of the source registers is the same. This is perfectly fine. Okay, you can have the source register and the destination register to be the same, no problem. What is happening here is the content of register S3 is going to be added to the constant 4, and the result is going to be stored in the updated into register S3 itself. So register S3 content is going to be overwritten with the previous content plus 4. Okay. So if S3 was bound to say a variable X in C programming language, you could have written it like X equal to X plus 4 or X plus equal to 4, whatever. Now, note that there is no sub I type of instruction. Subtract immediate instruction is not present. Okay. However, that's not a problem because you can always use the constant to be negative. So if you want to perform S3 equal to S3 minus 4, you can just write add I S3 minus 4, or here in this case they have decremented the content of register S2 by 1. How do you decrement it? You add minus 1 with the content. Very simple. So this is another new revelation, that negative numbers can be directly written by the programmer, and the assembler takes care of converting them to 2's complement in binary. Okay. Okay, you can write in decimal notation, no problem. The assembler will properly write it down in, convert it to binary. Another thing we'll very soon learn is the maximum size of this constant in ADDI type of instructions. Do you have any guess? Anybody has any guess? How many number of bits can this constant, say 4 in the first case or 1 minus 1 in the second case? What is the total number of bits possible? How large a number is possible to be mentioned here? Any number means I could have written any large number here and it would have still worked, or there is a limit to how large a number I can mention. And if there is a limit, why is there a limit? Anybody has any answer? At least guess, because we have not yet got to the topic. But I did mention something yesterday which might, if you remember it, then you might be able to at least partially answer this.
So the total instruction should be of size 32 bits, and ADDI has a particular opcode which is I think 6 bits. Each of the registers 5 bits. So
right. Okay.
using
So
that, I
I
think
think you already know.
16 bits. We can say that this minus.
Right. Very good. So basically that's kind of the complete answer. Basic idea is that, see, that this entire thing ADDI $S2 $S1 minus 1. Oh, it is $S2 $S1, not decrement. Sorry, S1 is decremented and stored in S2. These two are different registers. Anyways, this entire instruction ADDI $S2 $S1 minus 1 will finally be encoded into 32-bit binary. We will find that every register needs 5 bits to be uniquely identified because there are 32 registers. Okay, from $0 to $31, and the binary codes for them is the number of the register. So $0 is represented by 5-bit 0, etc. So represent $S2 takes 5 bits, representing $S1 takes 5 bits. The ADDI opcode actually here in this case they will use 6 bits. It is not necessary to use 6 bits, but that's how MIPS works. So 6 and 5 and 5, 16 bits are gone. So you are left with 16 more bits. So your immediate constant, whether it is a positive number or a negative number, can be maximum 16 bits long. Okay. So is this a good choice? Well, this might not be sufficient. 16 bits does not let you represent very large numbers. That's true. But most cases it is sufficient because small numbers are very common. And immediate operands avoids a load instruction. What we mean by avoids a load instruction is you first load a big constant into memory, then you load it into the register. That is possible. 32-bit you can load from memory to register. But then, loading from memory to register is a time-consuming thing, and you have to store the value in the memory location also. That is also something that is not very convenient. So there is support for this type of immediate instructions, which are used very, very, very commonly, because many of the times these are very useful in loops, writing loop type of structures, constructs. Because in loop, usually you change the loop variable in small steps, 1 or 2 or 4 or 8 at a time. Okay, so those can be very nicely handled by these ADDI type instructions, because small constants is not a problem. Now this $0 register, MIPS register number 0, that is $0 is hard coded to the constant 0. It cannot be overwritten. Okay, so it cannot be the destination of some code that you write. Now it is very, very useful to copy the content of one register to another register. In technical assembly language programming terms, this is called the move operation. Unfortunately, in MIPS, there is no direct move operation. There is something as a pseudo instruction called move, which we will later study. Later I'll mention. But as such, directly, such a simple operation of copying content of one register into another does not exist. However, that's not a problem, because you can always use the existing add instruction. Use a little bit of cleverness, and you know that I have a ready-made register hard-coded at value 0 called $0. Just use add to your source register to $0 and store it in the destination register. So the instruction given here basically copies the content of $S1 to $T2. Now there are few slides on signed and unsigned binary numbers. I will not go into them. However, I mean, you can go into the study them if to refresh. Okay, I expect you to know this because these have been taught in your C programming class also in first year, and probably in second year also when you took switching circuits and logic design, most of you. So I'll not go through them again. Just note that MIPS in certain contexts support unsigned numbers also, and we will mention them in what context they support it. The instructions like ADDI use 2's complement notation, and they use signed operations. So ADDI is a signed operation where the constant can either be a positive number or a negative number represented in 16-bit 2's complement system. Okay. Now there are certain operations which operate directly on unsigned values, means they interpret the constant that is mentioned to be an unsigned number, or they expect the operand to be an unsigned number and perform unsigned addition. So the representation of the interpretation of the number is different in different cases, and accordingly you will also interpret the result in different ways. Okay. So 32-bit 2's complement signed integers. One thing to note is a very peculiar thing. I think all of you know this, that the range of numbers represented in n-bit 2's complement system is not symmetrical about 0. There is one more negative number than the positive numbers. Signed negation, etc. they have taught. Okay, now this very important concept called sign extension. Okay, this is the cause of much confusion actually. Okay, this is a very simple concept, but unfortunately causes a lot of confusion. The question is, what will you do with unequal size operands? For example, say you have the ADDI instruction, right? Notice the ADDI instruction. See, $S3 is a 32-bit quantity. The content of $S3 is a 32-bit number. When you are adding 4 with it, 4 in 2's complement system will take whatever 100 with many zeros at the left. So in 16-bit 2's complement, it will be 13 zeros followed by 100. Fine. But the circuits do not add asymmetric, I mean unequal size operand. A circuit, say a 32-bit adder circuit, adds two 32-bit numbers. And you are doing some assignments on adder design, etc. You would be knowing. Okay. So what about the other 16 bits of this constant? So something has to be done. Fortunately, the solution is not very difficult. The solution is something called sign extension. If you use the 2's complement system, in the 2's complement system, you look at the, like you start representing the number, okay? Once you have represented 1 0 0 and then add one extra 0 to show that it is a positive number, the rest of the positions can be filled up by as many zeros as you like. The numerical value of that representation does not change. It still remains 4 plus 4. Similarly, for -1, you know that, well, whatever number of bits I require to represent -1, I will represent. Okay. After that, I will have to represent everything by ones. Means all the left positions can be filled up by as many ones as you want without changing the numerical value of the number. So this is a beautiful property of the 2's complement system. 2's complement system has many advantages. One of the advantages is this property is called sign extension. Okay. So one of the advantages is that the sign extension is very easy to do. You just copy the bit on the left, the first bit on the left which denotes the sign, and extend it as many times as you like. So what will happen is that for 4, 1 0 0 is necessary to represent the magnitude 4, then 1 0 is necessary to show that it is plus 4, but then there are 12 other positions to fill up 16 bits. You fill it up by 12 more zeros without worry. But then 16 bits more are required to fill it up to 32, because you require 32-bit numbers. You, without any worry, you add 16 more zeros. So that is quite trivial, because adding zeros does not change on the left, does not change the value of a number. That is quite trivial. But the non-trivial property is for the 2's complement thing, because in 2's complement, what is the representation of 2's complement in say 2's complement representation of -1? Can I ask anybody?
Sir, it will be
all ones, right? So what you do, you look at the magnitude. Magnitude is 1. You write 1. You require one more bit to denote the symbol -1. So you write one more. So you have just in 2 bits you are done, but you require a 16-bit constant. Fine. You extend it 14 more positions by 1. It becomes 16-bit. But when add-I comes, the circuit demands that, oh, you give me 16 more bits. No problem. I will just copy 1 to 16-bit more positions. That will be done automatically by the circuit internally. Okay. So this is how these things work. Many MIPS operations perform sign extension. For example, add-I. Later on, we will study instructions called, maybe not today, but maybe in later classes, instructions called LB and LH. LB copies the least significant byte into the register. Okay, into the least significant byte of another destination register from memory. Similarly, LH copies the least significant half word or double byte from a memory location to the least significant half word of a destination register. But in LB, 24 more places need to be filled up. The destination register is always 32. That is a constant size 32 in MIPS. We have already discussed this yesterday. So what will happen if you use LB? What about the other 16 locations, right? Other 24 locations, 24 bits. You have only covered 1 byte. So in that case, you automatically extend the copy the leftmost bit. You look at what was the leftmost bit of that 1 byte. If it is 1, the remaining 24 places you fill up with 1. If it is 0, you remaining 24 pieces you fill up with 0. This might seem a little strange because as we will find later that the LB and LH instructions actually are mostly used for string processing. So there this sign extension makes little sense. But okay, I mean you have to do something. So this something is what MIPS does here is sign extension. Then there are other types of instructions called branch on equal BEQ and branch on not equal BNE. We will study them in due course. They also extend. There is a parameter in that called displacement. They also extend. Okay. So say for example, they have given these examples. Say 8-bit to 16-bit conversion of +2. So +2 you can just represent using 3 bits. 1 0 to show the magnitude and 1 more bit 0 to show it is +2. But then it is an 8-bit number. So you add many zeros to convert it to 8-bit. But then you convert it to 16-bit by just left extend it with 0. Similarly, -2 you require only 3 bits. Okay. 1 0 and then 1 at the left. Okay, so I'll just come back in a minute. Okay, fine. So let's continue. So this we have already. So now we will come to a very important topic of representing instructions. Okay, that see right now till now what we have been doing is we have been writing instructions in with opcodes and operands in almost in English. Okay. But that is not how things work on a microprocessor. The microprocessor does not understand any human readable language. It understands only strings of zeros and ones. And this concept that everything in a computer, including the instruction to tell it what operation to perform, even that can be converted to binary and stored on it, and it can execute these instructions, fetch it from memory and execute it serially one by one. This is a major breakthrough concept. It doesn't look like much nowadays that you will say what's the big deal? It's a circuit. it's a circuit, so it will take binary input data, operate on it, and it will produce some binary output. Well, that is fine, but this concept that even it will operate on it, okay, what operation it will do, even that will be encoded in some form in binary and kept along with the data in the same memory. This is a new concept. Okay, so this concept, this is a new, not a new concept, but this is a kind of a novel concept. So this is called a stored program memory computer. We'll see this very soon, and probably it has been taught when in the previous classes. So these instructions are encoded in binary, and in machine code they are stored. For example, when you compile a C program using CC or GCC, the final executable that is produced, say a.out, is in binary machine code form. You cannot directly read it. It's not a human readable form. Okay, in MIPS, every instruction as a rule is 32 bits. So it said that every instruction word is 32 bit. Okay. Now, what is the advantage? Because the format is relatively fixed and there are not too many there are some variations among the different classes of instructions. For example, arithmetic instructions or load store instructions, they differ in some ways, but the formats are not wholesale different. They are not that different that it becomes unmanageable. Okay. And secondly, this makes the hardware design much easier. Okay. Not all instruction sets are like this. For example, in x86-64, even the number of bits that are used to represent the instruction is not constant. There, the number of instructions used to represent a bit can vary from 8 bits, that is 1 byte, up to say 12 bytes, that is 108 bits. Okay, or not 12, say even more. Say something like, yeah, 108 bits or something like that. So this is quite extraordinary. Okay, I mean, so there, try to imagine from a circuit designer's perspective. When the circuit designer is designing the microprocessor has read in 32-bit stuff from memory. Okay. Even a x86-64 processor would probably read in either a 32-bit or a 64-bit word from memory. Okay. After that, the circuit tries to make sense of what has to be done. How does it try to make sense? First, in MIPS, it knows this is a complete instruction. Okay, there is no, I mean, there is exactly one instruction here. Okay. In the other case, first it has to make sure, well, whether this is a 8-bit instruction or a 16-bit instruction or a 100-bit instruction, not sure. Okay. So this is quite, I mean, quite cumbersome actually, and troubling, and the circuit design becomes very complicated. Okay. So, now the register numbers we have already discussed. They are from 8 to 15 is the T0 registers, T8, T9 are 24, 25, and S0 to S7 are 16 to 23. So we have already discussed this. Okay. So this, why did they suddenly mention this and not the other registers? Because as I told you, this is the primary workhorse of assembly language programming in MIPS 32. Other registers, as time comes, of course we will use. But to start with, you can survive with these registers only. Okay, and again, you don't, well, if you memorize, you don't need to memorize register numbers, but maybe if you remember this 8 to 15 range and 24, 25, 40 registers and 16 to 23 for S registers, there is no harm, because it sometimes it helps you to debug some other things. Now let's come to look. We have looked at instructions from viewpoints of what their operation is, right? So we have seen arithmetic instructions. We have seen these load store instructions. We have seen immediate instructions. Fine. And later on we will see some more instructions like branch and jump instructions, etc. So now we will look at instructions from a slightly different viewpoint. The viewpoint is that in the instruction format, okay, the binary format of the instruction, that will be the classification criteria. So the first format we look at are R format instructions or register format instructions. How are these instructions encoded? The encoding will be done by the assembler, okay, which has knowledge of how this thing, how every individual instruction is encoded, and then it will be stored in converted to this binary form and stored in memory. So you don't need to memorize everything, but you should know that at least the format of the instructions. In the MIPS R format instructions, the leftmost 6 bits denotes the opcode. The next 5 bits denotes the first source register. The next 5 bits denote the second source register. RS and RT denote the source registers. The third 5 bits denote the destination register, RD. Then the next 5 bits denote something called shift amount. Shift amount is a quantity that is relevant only for instructions which perform right shift or left shift. This is not relevant for other types of instructions. However, this field is maintained in every instruction, and in instructions where this field is not relevant, say the add instruction, which you have already seen, or add I instructions maybe. Add I probably, I don't know, maybe it won't have a shift amount. Say the add instruction, there it will be all bit zeros. Okay. Finally, there is something called a function code. The concept of function code is very similar to opcode. Function code here also is 6 bits. The function code is an extension of the opcode. What I mean by extension of the opcode is there might be situations where closely related instructions have exactly the same opcode. Means the leftmost 6 bits will be kept the same to denote that they are very closely related instructions. Their only differentiation parameter will be this rightmost 6 bits, which will be slightly different. For example, the add and sub instructions are very similar. The add and sub instructions, one maybe can be kept with the same opcode on the left, but of course one will perform add and the other will perform sub. So you have to differentiate them in some way. What you do is you change the function code slightly. Maybe for one you have something, and maybe add for you have some 6-bit constant, and for sub you denote some other 6-bit constant, and then the hardware understands when it sees this total 12 bits opcode and function code combined, it understands that add has to be performed and it understands that sub has to be performed. So you might say this is unnecessary complication. Why don't we from the very beginning we have a 12-bit opcode, then all problems will be solved? Yes, that is true. But this organization of dividing out the opcode into an opcode and a function code has become popular because this helps circuit designers to a certain extent, because circuit designers can concentrate on designing the decoding circuitry. The decoding circuitry is a circuit which reads this binary instruction format and tries to make sense of it. The decoding circuitry becomes similar if the opcode of similar types of operations are kept as similar as possible and the function code changes slightly. Okay, so that's the reason why opcode and function code are kept separate. In your lab assignment later on, maybe if we give you a small instruction set to design and implement on FPGA, there also you will find, probably we will mention that you decide your own instruction encoding, but maintain the opcode and function code this convention, because this is a useful convention than a monolithic 12-bit opcode. Let's see some examples. Say add $T0, $S1, $S2. What is $T0? $T0 is register number 8. To denote 8 in unsigned. Okay, so these register numbers all will be represented in unsigned integers. Okay, so this 5-bit denote unsigned integers. Okay, register number T0 is 8. 8 in 5 bits is 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. So here 0, 1, 0, 0, 0 comes as expected. S1 and S2 are register number 17 and 18. So you write 5-bit representation of 17 and 5-bit representation of 18. Don't get confused that there are ones on the left. For the RS, RT, RD representations in binary, we will use only unsigned representations. Okay, so it is okay if there is a 1 on the left. Now, the opcode is for add is 0. Okay, so all bits are zeros, 6 bits are zeros, and the function code is for add is 32. Why 32? Well, that's kind of ad hoc, but it is 32 and it is 1 followed by all zeros. It's 32. Again, the function code and opcode representations are again in unsigned quantities. So 32 is represented in 6 bits using 1 on the left, and that is fine. There should not be any confusion that why is there a 1 on the left. So you actually can represent many types of add type operations here. Even if you keep the opcode to be 0 constant, just using a 6-bit function code, you could have represented 64 types of add subtype instructions. Okay, but we do not have, MIPS does not have so many instructions, but having 6-bit doesn't have. If in future somebody wants to extend the instruction set by adding more hardware, there he can come up with a new function code and decide what is going to be there. So overall, this concatenate all of this and you get a 32-bit string. This thing in hex is this. This thing, when the microprocessor reads this instruction, okay, it interprets and it has circuitry internally to understand that this corresponds exactly to the operation add $T0, $S1, $S2. The conversion of the reverse conversion of this add $T0, $S1, $S2 to this thing. Not I shouldn't call it the reverse conversion. That is probably the forward conversion. This is done by, this is the assembler's job. That's what the assembler does. Okay. If the assembler was not there, then you needed to encode this entire thing in binary and put it inside the computer. And for every instruction you needed to do it. This was the situation for a long time till the 1950s or 1960s. This was the situation that even assemblers were not available, because to run an assembler, okay, because high level programming languages were not that many available. So to write an assembler, first of all, you need to write a program. Secondly, the assembler itself to run required memory. So that's an additional software that was sometimes not available because memory was very precious. Okay, only a few megabytes maximum. Now we can't even think that how can a computer, and maybe a computer costs millions of dollars, millions. Okay, like nobody could afford a personal computer. There was no concept of a personal computer. Computers were all in universities or in very large corporations like IBM or so, and people used to log in from dumb terminals to these server type computers and work there. Okay, so this was the situation for a long time. The concept of personal computer, that every person at home can have a small computer, this kind of came up from about the late 70s. Before that, personal computers were simply not there. Okay. So if you did not have an assembler software, you needed to encode this entire thing in binary in some format. There are many ways in which you could do it. One of the common ways was through something called a punch card. Okay, so this was a strange type of a card where you needed to follow some code and punch in your code into that and then submit it to the job center in the computer. Okay, center. So this was batch processing, which means that one person's code will finish executing, only then the second person's code will start executing, and then it will start, and then in the third person's code, etc. If you have made only one mistake, there was no debugging. Try to understand. Whatever you have written, that's final. Where will you debug? Okay, you don't have access to the computer all the time. The only way to know that there is some mistake in the code is actually to try to run it. But trying to run it is in batch processing mode. So your turn will come probably 7 days later, because 100 other people are waiting to get their stuff done. After 7 days, you get your slot. They insert your punch card inside the computer. It starts executing, and it at some point of time there is an error, and the program execution stops. They will return you the code saying there has been this error. Now you debug. Again, you submit the program to the computer center. Again, your turn comes after 7 days. And again, there is another bug. It is possible that your program will have more bugs. Along with it, just imagine the amount of stress. If every instruction binary encoding, you have to look at the manual, look at the encoding, come up with the exact, even 1 bit mistake you cannot make, because then even 1 bit mistake in this 32 bits is an error. Come up with an exact binary string for one instruction, then look at the next instruction, come up with the exact binary string for that, etc. And it was, I mean, computers were said to make life simple, but it was actually making life hell actually. So this is the hell that many early programmers went through actually. Okay. So we are very fortunate that we don't have to go through this hell most of the time. Okay, then they have these slides. They have discussed hexadecimal notation. I won't go through it. All of you know it. Okay. Now for the MIPS I format or immediate operand format instructions, there are also immediate load store instructions. Some of them we'll study later. Here 6-bit opcode followed by, there is no function code, okay, followed by 5 bits for the source register, 5 bits for the destination register, and then the 16-bit constant. Okay, we have already discussed that the constant can be maximum 16 bits, and because the constant is interpreted as a 2's complement now, the constant range maximum is 16-bit 2's complement corresponds to minus 2 power 15 to plus 2 power 15 minus 1. Okay, so this is not a very large range. 2 power 15 is, I don't know. I mean, 2 power 10 is about 1000. 2 power 15 is about 32,000 something. That is not a very large number, but for most programming, daily life programming that you do, it is fine. And how to work with larger numbers? If this is not, there are tricks by which you can work with larger numbers, store larger numbers into registers, etc. We will learn them as time goes. Okay. So again, they have mentioned that for different types of instructions, even for R and I format instructions, you notice that a large part of the instruction format is the same. There is still a 6-bit opcode, 2 5-bit register identifiers, and there is a 16-bit constant for instruct I format, whereas here there was some shift amount and function code, and there was another register. Of course, there are some differences also, but large parts are half of the format is kind of similar. So this makes circuit design easier. Now, as I said, that instructions are represented in binary, and binary and instructions and data, binary data, everything can be stored on the same memory. Okay, so this was also a major breakthrough of understanding that instructions and the data on which they will work, they can be stored in the same memory. Okay. So this binary compatibility of compiled programs, if the processor is the same, okay, maybe the operating system is the same, you will often find software are distributed in binary forms. Okay, so have you thought why is it, I mean, how is it possible that a program written and compiled on a different computer can work exactly the same way on your computer? It can work if the instruction set of your computer and the computer on which it was written, they are the same. Okay, so if they are the same, in that case, it is possible to execute it. There are some operating system specific things also, like how the program starts to execute, how does it link with certain libraries during runtime. There are some operating system dependencies also. That's why typically you find binaries mentioning two things. One is on what operating system it will run, and the other is the one what is the target microprocessor on which it will run. Okay, so if these two are constant, then you can also run it on your machine. Now let us now study interesting logical operations, extremely useful all the time they are used, and very interesting and very clever. Very clever in the sense that where they can be used very cleverly to perform many different things. Okay. There are the usual shift left data and shift right, shift left and shift right operands. There are the bitwise operands. Okay, and there are the bitwise and, bitwise or, and bitwise not operands. Okay, so these are kind of similar to C and Verilog operands. The MIPS instructions are SLL shift left logical, SRL shift right logical, bitwise AND is AND, and there is an add AND immediate instruction AND-I. There is bitwise OR and an OR immediate instruction OR-I. There is a bitwise NOT. There is no bitwise NOT. This is not a typo. it is actually NOR operation. Why? Because if you have NOR operation, it is not very difficult to perform bitwise NOT operation, right? So MIPS has a 3-operand NOR operation, which takes 2 source registers and perform a logical NOR between them and stores it in a destination register. But for a NOT operation, NOT is essentially a 2-operand operation, right? There is only 1 source register and 1 destination register. What to do? Well, you have in your hand this extremely valuable $0 register. So why don't you just NOR with 0? So if you NOR with 0, then it comes down to NOT, right? So in this case, in this particular instruction, the register T0 will get the inverted, bitwise inverted version of register T1. In the shift operation, there are 2 versions. Now the shift amount becomes important, and you know these are only 32-bit register values. So maximum shifting can be represented by 5 bits. 5 bits will let you represent up to 31-bit shifting, which is okay. 32-bit shifting means everything will become 0 or something useless. You will lose the entire content, so it doesn't make much sense. So up to 31-bit shifting is supported by 5 bits, and then the usual RS, RT, and RT operations there. There is an opcode and there is a function code. The shift left logical performs left shifting by the shift amount and fills in all the positions on the right that are created by left shifting. All the vacant positions are created by zeros. So this is multiplication by 2 power I. I think both for positive numbers as well as negative numbers. Okay. For the shift right logical, it shifts right and it fills up with zeros. So this is something a little strange. Both are strange. Both are strange in a sense. Both the shift left logical and shift right logical are slightly strange because, see, you do not know what is going to happen to the leftmost bit, that is the MSB bit, which is denoting your sign. In the shift left logical, if you denote say 1 position, earlier there was 1 on the left. So if you had interpreted it as a 2's complement number, it would have been a negative number. Now if shifted 1 position to the left, now suddenly the next bit was 0, so 0 becomes the MSB. That case, its interpretation is it has become a positive number. So this shift left operation does not respect any sign convention. That's why this is called a logical shifting. This is not arithmetic shifting. Arithmetic shifting is something which respects sign conventions. Here, no sign convention is respected. Similarly, shift right logical, by force you will fill up all the vacant positions that are being created on the left by zeros. Filling up vacant positions being created on the right by zeros, as happens in shift left logical, is less problematic because that does not, filling up zeros on the right does not affect the sign of the quantity. Okay. But filling up zeros on the left, if initially it was a positive number, okay, no problem. It must have had a 0 on the left, so you fill up with additional zeros on the left, no problem. Positive remains positive. But if it had a 1 at the most significant bit, and then you are filling up with zeros on the left, that's problematic. That means it is being now changed to a positive number suddenly. That's why again this is called a logical right shift. It does not respect any arithmetic sign conventions. And as you know that if you shift right by I bits, the number is divided by 2 power I, but this time only for unsigned, because you have to be careful. The number no longer might remain a negative number. It no longer can remain a negative number, in fact, because it forcibly turns it to a positive number by putting in zeros on the left. So only for unsigned numbers, if you have an interpretation, then okay, then it is divided by 2 power I. And this is an easy way to perform multiplication and division by I if you have the opportunity to sorry, not the opportunity. If you need at any point of time in your code to divide by or divide or multiply by powers of 2, please use the shift operations in place of the multiplication or division operations, because the multiplication or division operations are very cumbersome. Okay, difficult to implement circuits, as you will study later in the course. We will study them in detail, and you will find that it is quite painful actually to implement them. Final one question I have you been in the previous class where you taught okay, let me put the question in some other way. How do you implement this arbitrary number of shiftings by I positions in a hardware circuit? Have you been taught any circuit to do this? How do you perform right shifting or left shifting?
We have a shift register and you have select line for choosing when to stop.
Yeah, shift register is a correct answer. Unfortunately, in shift register to perform an I bit shift, you require I clock cycles. Right?
Yes, sir.
No. So this solution is not feasible to be accepted here, because in MIPS all basic arithmetic operations like add, sub, MIP and shift, etc., they must have a time guarantee of 1 clock cycle. Means they must complete within 1 clock cycle. So you need to perform one arbitrary number of shifts ranging from 0 to 31, any quantity, any number of shifts in 1 clock cycle. Have you been taught any circuit to do it? Of course, it has to be a combinational circuit. It's not a sequential circuit. Probably you have not been taught. The way you do this is through a circuit called a barrel shifter. Okay. So because you have not been taught, I mean, it's fine. I am not expecting that you will be taught a barrel shifter in digital logic circuit because in class, because it's quite complicated circuit. We will study the barrel shifter maybe in the lab for those of you who are in the lab, and maybe we'll have an assignment based on it. For those of you who are not in the lab, I would recommend, and also all of you actually, so just have a look, search for barrel shifter online to know about the structure of this very clever circuit that can perform arbitrary number of shifts in 1 clock cycle. Fine. Let us now have a look at some basic logic operations. Very simple. And is logic operation that is basically an R type operation. It performs the bitwise AND between two source registers and stores the result in the destination register. The destination register itself can be one of the source registers, in which case the content of that source register is kind of overwritten. So they have given example, quite simple. Similarly, OR. Okay, bitwise OR can be performed. Not we have already discussed, nor we have already discussed there is an bitwise NOR operation and how it can be used to implement bitwise inversion or not in a slightly tricky way using the $0 register. Now we are coming to portions of the instruction set which are a little peculiar. They are peculiar because their behavior is not, I mean, the behavior is slightly more difficult to understand and not always very intuitively obvious. So please pay attention. Okay. The next type of instructions, class of instructions that we are going to study are called branch instructions. Branch instructions allow you to execute code in non-sequential fashion, to make sudden branches or jumps inside code. Branch in high-level languages are, all of us know, are very common. There are if-else type of branches. Then there is a switch case type of branch. Any other type of branch in C programming language that you can think of, where the normal sequential execution of code is affected and you perform a non-sequential execution of code?
Break and continue.
Very good. Break and continue. Then
Exceptions.
Exception is not directly supported in C. Let us keep us confined within C. Exceptions, in fact, function calls themselves are probably non-sequential execution, right? As you will see very soon, that the function call is essentially through a jump mechanism in MIPS, which is non-sequential execution. One important thing you are missing. When somebody said break and continue are usually part of what type of constructs?
Loop.
They occur inside what type of constructs? Loops. Good. Is loop an example of sequential execution or non-sequential execution? Any loop which is going to run more than one time.
Non-sequential.
Because it's a non-sequential. So loop is the most even probably more than if-else clauses. Loop is a example of non-sequential execution, loop constructs. Okay, are the most common examples of non-sequential execution, and the non-sequential execution is rampant there. If a loop runs 100 times, 99 times it has performed non-sequential execution, because from the last statement in the loop body, it has gone to the first statement of the loop body 99 times. Only the last time it performed, it did not do that and came out of the loop. Either through a break statement or because the loop normally terminated. So non-sequential execution is extremely common in high-level programming language, and as you translate them into assembly language programming language, they are also very common. Common statistics have shown that in usual assembly language programs that you normal human beings write and which are from normal applications, about 1/6 of every instruction is a branch or jump type instructions. About 1/6, somebody say about 1/7. Essentially, this means that if you consider a block of 6 or 7 consecutive instructions, there is a high possibility. Just hold for a moment. Yeah. So if you consider a block of 6 or 7 instructions, there is a high chance that at least one of them will be a branch or jump instructions. A block of instructions with a jump instruction or branch instruction at its end, at its boundary, is called a basic block. Okay, so basic block of instructions. So the average size of a basic block of instructions is about 6 instructions or 7 instructions on average in an average program. Of course, you can write artificial programs where there will be very few branch or jump instructions or no branch or jump instructions. Even that might be possible. Or you can write programs in which every alternate instruction will be, say, branch or jump instruction. Very common. They will be very common. But these are artificial programs. I mean, these you can come up with something, conjure up something by being creative, but those are not real life programs probably. I mean, statistics across a wide range of programs have shown that approximately every 6 or 7 branch instructions is a branch. This is, well, 6 or 7 is a small number. Okay, I mean, the problem when we later study the processor hardware design in detail, processors do not handle non-sequential execution very well, nicely. This is a problem. They are not designed to handle non-sequential execution. They are very good in executing sequential executions if everything is in perfect order. The order in which the instructions are read from memory, if the exact order, in that order, if they are executed, then the processor performance is extremely good. Unfortunately, if every 6 or 7 instructions it has to suddenly branch or jump on average, they face a lot of problems. Why they face a lot of problems? Well, to increase the performance of processors, modern microprocessors have something called pipelining. In pipelining, the processor starts executing other instructions in advance before completing the execution of one instruction. So this is called overlapped instruction. Right now, the model that we are studying is a non-pipelined execution where you are getting a view that one instruction will be executed, then the next instruction will start. That is not the case in real processors. Even in MIPS, that is not the case. And a large time in the course we will spend on studying pipelined MIPS processor design later on. When we study pipeline MIPS processor design, you will find that the pipeline, hardware pipeline, is designed to expect sequential execution. And when suddenly during execution it discovers that the flow is going to be non-sequential, by that time it has already committed itself to executing some other instructions which it should not have executed. So finding this out, that the instruction that I have started executing is not correct, I actually should execute something else, that should be found out as soon as possible so that you don't waste too much time. Okay. I mean, it's like, what example should I give? So in my college life, I had a friend in my class who was very good at memorizing stuff. And we had a paper on humanities, English and something, which required a lot of memorization, okay, and required long essay type answers. So on the day of our exam, all of us thought that there will be, I mean, it was not his fault actually as such, all of us thought that there will be one particular question which is going to come, because it's a very popular question. Almost every year in the question paper you find that question. So what happened was, as soon as the answer scripts copies were given, he did not wait for the question paper and started writing the answer to that question, where the expectation was it is almost certain it is going to come. Unfortunately, in that year, that question was not set. Okay, so that question was not included in the question, and that he found out, and there was some delay in the question paper. And just as luck would have it, only on that day there was some delay in distribution of question papers. So about 10 minutes after the scheduled start of exams, actually question papers reached the room, exam hall. And then he got the question paper and found that that question has not come. By that time, he had finished writing at weight, because he had memorized the answer, writing the almost 2 full pages he had written. Okay. And then he had to cut it out, and everybody was laughing. Those who were sitting near him and knew what he was doing. So this is like that. If you discover there has been a mistake, you have to do the necessary cleaning up fast. Otherwise, too much effort gets wasted. Now, to aid this necessary cleaning up fast in microprocessors, there are hardware-based schemes. There are software-based schemes to make the microprocessor's task easy, compiler-based schemes, and there are also hardware-based schemes to make the task easy. Some of these schemes we will study in this course, the simpler schemes. The more complicated schemes you will study if you take the HP. Those who are in the dual degree course will take the HPCA course. And if any other student you take the HPCA course, you will study the hardware techniques to solve the problem of branching in microprocessors. Branching is a hugely problematic case. Okay, I mean, in a pipeline processor, it confuses the entire pipeline and kind of stops the operation. It is as bad as that. But of course, branches are so common that something has to be done, and that something, what has to be done, we will study later on. There are 3 types of branches. Actually, there are 4 branches. The 3 shown here and 2 more variants of the J type instruction. These 5 type of branches are very common. The 2 other variants of J type instructions are related to function calls, and probably we will not study them today, maybe in the next class. Let us try to understand these 3 branch instructions. Okay. Branching in MIPS or any other assembly language programming essentially follows the go-to syntax of C programming language. In fact, the go-to syntax of the go-to construct of the C programming language is a copy of this assembly language branching. It's not the reverse thing, that from C it has come to assembly language. It existed in assembly language programming before C, from which C borrowed it. In your programming, I doubt if in your day-to-day programming any of you ever use go-to statements in C. When I was taught programming, or when you have been taught programming also, your teacher has taught you, please avoid go-to, it leads to spaghetti code. If your code has go-to, it becomes very, very difficult to debug. Please don't have it, etc. Use other constructs. Fine. In assembly language programming, you will find go-to is the only way to perform branching. There is no other way. So as I said, every average 6 or 7 instructions is a branch. Every 6th or 7th instruction that you write is going to use a go-to. Is that good? Well, it's not good, but if the hardware only supports this, what to do? I mean, you will need to write assembly language program to do this. That's why assembly language programming is so error prone and so buggy. Okay, if there is a bug in an assembly language program, debugging it is a nightmare actually. So you write it very carefully. visualize the program flow as you keep on writing it, because that is very important. Branch on equal. Okay, what does it do? Well, it looks at a instruction label L1. What is instruction label L1? You can arbitrarily label your code with this type of syntax where you write a text string as a label followed by a colon symbol. So in this case, in this code that I am showing, you will find that there are two labels. One is called an capital ELSE, another is called a capital EXIT. These else and exit do not have any meaning to the assembler. Those are just text labels. These are not keywords. As soon as the assembler sees this followed by a colon, it understands this is a text label, this is not a keyword. And these only are used to jump to those locations. So the advantage of using labels is you do not need to mention to what address you need to jump. Every instruction has an address. There are two ways to identify instructions. Either mention the exact address at which your destination jump is, where you want to jump to, or you mention is equivalent label. Mentioning the destination address is very difficult because we don't know the destination address before the assembler has assembled it into some binary form. No problem. We will use text labels and the assembler will take the trouble of finally converting it to a binary form with actual addresses. Remember that this L1 label would also have to be resolved to a final address, because this BEQ RS RT L1, this 32-bit instruction will contain the information of exactly what to perform the jump. And how does the assembler compute? What does the assembler store corresponding to L1? These are things we will study again later. Okay, maybe not today, because this is complicated. This is going to be one of the last topics that we are going to study, even after we study function calls, because this is one of the most complicated topics actually. Now, what does the BEQ instruction does? It compares the contents of two registers, say RS and RT, register source and register destination. I mean, two source registers. If RS equal to RT, go to L1. This is the equivalent C construct. Then BNE performs exactly the reverse. If RS not equal to RT, go to L1. And there is an unconditional jump JL1, that is just go to L1. Okay. Now let's see some examples. First, this is all the time you write this type of code. I mean, this is such a common construct that there is just a two-branch if-else clause. The corresponding control flow diagram has been shown on the right. You compare two variables I and j. Once you compare the two variables I and j, if I and j are equal, you perform an addition and store the value in variable f. You perform the addition on g and h. And if they are not equal, you perform a subtraction. So this is very, very, very easy and very common programming construct in C. How does this translate to assembly? First of all, we have to assume our variable binding to registers. Suppose the variable binding in this case, they are using all S registers. So F in S0, G in S1, H in S2, I in S3, etc., etc. J in S4, whatever. First, if they are not equal, go to else. So you write, so they have just changed the logic a little bit. They are doing it if I not equal to j, go to f, go to subtraction actually. So that is okay. I mean, the logic is the same. The functionality is the same. They have changed the if else construct a little bit while translating. If S3 and S4 are not equal, jump to label else. There is an instruction labeled with label else and a colon, which says I perform a subtraction of S2 from S1 and store the result to S0. Otherwise, if the BNE instruction fails, why does it fail? Because these two registers are exactly equal. In that case, the BNE instruction fails and the branch does not occur and sequential execution continues. In that case, you perform an addition, but after performing the addition, you don't want to execute the else statement because that is a completely like separate clause. Okay, so you jump, you skip over that else statement by using another unconditional jump statement. This code is slightly unnecessarily complicated. I think this 4-5 line assembly language code can be simplified, but I think intentionally they have given this format because to show you the usage of both BNE and jump instructions in the same code snippet. Any question about this? Students, anybody has any question? Do you have any difficulty in understanding this? Hello? Anybody has any difficulty understanding this? Nobody has any difficulty? Okay, then I'll proceed. Oh, by the way, in MIPS assembly language programming, comments start with hash. I think we have not mentioned it till now. In the Thursday class, I will give you a demo of actually running MIPS assembly language programs using the SPIM simulator that I have installed on my laptop. Okay. So in the meantime, if you could please install the Qt SPIM simulator, the Qt SPIM simulator from the website that has been mentioned in the course details, that would help. Because then you can start writing your own code for practice and play around with the tool. It's a very easy to use tool. Okay. I will give you a demo with some extremely simple programs. There are some peculiarities about the input-output features of the SPIM assembler. I mean, not the SPIM assembler as such, I mean, MIPS programming itself. The way it performs input-output, that has to be explained a little bit. That will take a few minutes. And but once you understand that, the remaining part of the code is just what we are covering now. In the slides, that input-output portion is not covered. So I will explain it from the SPIM manual that I have uploaded, with of course with the example code and to show you actually how it works. Input output basically means how to take in arguments and how to print messages and values on the screen. So these are very common things that you use the printf and scanf functions for in C. Unfortunately, there is no direct functions in assembly language programming to do that. Why there is no direct function, I will explain. Maybe some of you or many of you already know. It involves system calls. It needs help from the operating system, etc. And again, I'll explain it. And anyways, I'll show you some example. Now let's continue. Let us have a look at how to compile loop statements. Okay. Look at the C code. It's a peculiar code. I mean, as such, I don't think I've ever seen a code like this or ever written a code which needed this piece of functionality. There is an array called save. It iterates over the values in the array save the iterator is the variable, a loop variable is I, and it compares whether every value that is there in the array is exactly the same and equal to some constant called k. Now, and it just skips over the array until the first position at which this equality comparison fails, it stops. Now, suppose the variable I is in S3, of course, I has to be initialized to 0. K is suppose stored in S5, and suppose somebody has stored the address of save, starting address of save in S6. Now, this is how the compiled MIPS code look like. Ignore the comment in red for now. Let us first look at the code, then we will discuss the problem in the C code. So add first S3 has to be, I has to be initialized to 0. So what you do is you initialize add to 0 by add $S3 $0 $0. There is a pseudo instruction or instruction which the assembler supports and converts directly to an equivalent series of instructions or one equivalent instruction like the one shown here called LI, load immediate. Load immediate is, there is no instruction called load immediate in as such supported by the hardware. So if the assembler sees an instruction called LI written by the user, it will automatically convert it to probably that add $S3 $0 $0 form. But to write it in short, you could have also written LI $S3, 0. This also would have worked and had performed exactly the same thing to initialize register S3 to 0. Then you start a loop. These are integers, okay? So every jump you make, every integer you read occupies 4 bytes. So the next index basically occupies next indexed address should go to a 4 byte offset from the beginning, and the next again 4 byte in the front, again 4 byte in the front, etc. In C, pointer arithmetic is automatic. Whatever is the type of the variable you are using, int, float, double, char, doesn't matter. The compiler knows the length of each of these variables on your target architecture, and while generating the assembly language code or the final binary, it performs the pointer arithmetic on its own. So in C, if you have a pointer I or say pointer P, you can write P plus 1, but P plus 1 won't be P location followed by 1 byte. It will be P location followed by the number of bytes that is occupied by the type of variable pointed to by P. So automatically it skips over 4 bytes in this case. Here nothing is automatic. You are the compiler, okay? So you are generating the assembly language code manually. So you have to keep track of this. How do they do it? It notices that there is a pattern in the offsets that I need. The pattern is 0, 4, 8, 12, etc. And 0 is 0 multiplied, 0 shifted by 2 positions to the left. 4 is 1 shifted by 2 positions to the left. Okay. 8 is 2 shifted by 2 positions to the left. 12 is 3 shifted by 2 positions to the left, etc. Why? Because shifting anything by 2 positions to the left multiplies everything by 4. It multiplies it by 4. So for the offset, I require a loop, which a little trickily they use the shift left logical instruction to implement. The loop variable as such will increase by 1 as in the C code. But the offset, the pointer arithmetic, will be done with the SLL instruction, which will multiply it by 4 and put the actual value. So how does it work? First, $S3 is at 0. The loop variable is at 0. You shift it 2 positions, 0 remains 0, comes to T1, it is 0. Then it adds the offset T1 to $S6. Remember $X6 contains the starting address of the array save. Fine. Starting address plus 0 is still the first element starting address. So it loads it. Notice that the offset is exactly 0 in the load LW instruction because the exact offset that is required is entirely contained in register T1 now. It loads it in T0. Is T0, if the value in T0 exactly same as the constant that has been stored in S5? If they are not equal, exit. Otherwise, you increase the loop variable by 1 by performing an add-I instruction. So S3 is incremented by 1 and then you jump unconditionally to the loop. Right, loop beginning. Now next time S3 is 1, multiply it by 4 by shifting it 2 positions to the left. So now your offset becomes 4 and then you add that offset to the base address S6 to obtain the final address, exact address from which you should get it. Notice the dual usage of T1. T1 first gets the offset, then T1 is overwritten to get the final address. That is fine, no problem. Okay, and then T1 is used to get, to actually go to that as the base register for in the LW instruction. To go to that location from which the value is to be fetched. Any question? Students, any question? Are you there? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Any question about this code? Again, you could have written it in a different way without using shift operations on the left. You could have added 4, add-I 4 to the loop variable or some address variable and you could have proceeded like that. Here they have shown what happens in pointer arithmetic. That's why they have used the SLL instruction intentionally. Going over an array is a pointer arithmetic. Okay. The save square bracket I. This is just this is internally this doesn't as such make doesn't have any special meaning. The meaning internally is star in bracket save plus I. That is what is happening. Okay, that pointer arithmetic, how it gets converted in assembly language is being shown here. If you do not want to, if you want to perform the pointer arithmetic in a simpler way just by arithmetic additions with 4, fine, you can do it, no problem. Okay. Now, please explain what is the bug in the code, in the C code. The MIPS code is logically correct. Logically correct. There is a bug in the C code, and as usual, there is also a bug in the MIPS code. But it's not, sorry, it's not logically correct. Oh, I have written logically correct because the translation is correct in that sense. But there is an operational bug here. Probably this code, there is a chance this code, if you execute, there will be an memory violation error and a code down. Yeah.
If the whole array save array is K, then at the end of the like when I will reach
exactly, there is no array bound checking. How do you understand how you are reaching the length of the array? There should have been another loop. We should have kept track of how much, how far you have progressed. What is the value of I? That is not there. So what will happen is, if by chance, say it's a 10 element array, all the 10 elements are the constant K. Then it tries to access up to 9, index 9, no problem. As soon as it tries to access index 10, which this code will, there is no way you can stop it from doing it. God knows what will happen. Okay, there can be a memory violation error. There might not be any memory violation error, but that is what will happen is not correct. This is a bug. If there is a memory violation error, you will get a seg fault and your program will crash. Okay, fine. So this is a very simple, very simple 5-6 line block of code, but this shows the loop construct, this shows the branching, and most importantly construct, and most importantly it shows how C pointer arithmetic translates to assembly language. Okay, and it makes the implicit meaning of the notation save bracket I clear. The implicit meaning is there is a pointer pointing to the beginning of the array, and when you are writing save I, save bracket square bracket I, it is getting converted to star of save plus I, and then a pointer arithmetic is happening which keeps track of how many bytes every array block occupies, and it is forwarding the pointer to that place, fetching the values and comparing, etc. By the way, not forwarding the base pointer. The base pointer remains the same. The base pointer is always at S6 constant. That's a very important piece of information. That should not change. We just perform pointer arithmetic, store it in another variable called t1 and then use it. Yeah, so this is basic block of what I was saying. The basic block is a sequence of instructions with no embedded branches except at the end, and there is no branch target except at the beginning. Compiler can identify basic blocks for optimization. Basic blocks can be optimized very peacefully because there is no branch or jump in between inside a basic block. There are branch and jumps at the boundaries, but there is nothing inside. Okay, and an advanced processor can accelerate the execution of basic blocks by taking all the instructions in a basic block and trying to execute it at one go. Of course, if you want to execute multiple instructions at one go, this is in addition to pipelining. Please try to understand. Pipelining in one clock cycle starts to execute one instruction, in the next clock cycle starts to execute another instruction, where the first instruction has not yet finished execution. In the MIPS pipeline that we are going to study, one instruction is going to finish execution. If there is no other issue, it is going to finish execution in exactly 5 clock cycles fixed. So in these 5 clock cycles, in an overlapped manner, first instruction would finish, second instruction would have completed 4 clock cycles and need 1 more clock cycle to finish. Third instruction would have completed 3 clock cycles and need 2 more clock cycles to finish, etc., etc. What this advanced processor that they're saying here, all the 5 instructions will be issued at the same time. So they will be thrown to the hardware saying you try to execute all of them together. But there might be dependencies. It might not be possible to simultaneously execute them all at one go. Now there are hardware mechanisms, there are software mechanisms like compiler optimizations to try to resolve dependencies as much as possible inside basic blocks, so that the task for the hardware becomes easy. But there is also hardware dependency resolvers and mechanisms by which simultaneous execution of multiple instructions can be started. Such processors which can start to execute multiple instructions at one go, of course you need multiple execution units for that, are called superscalar processors. Okay, superscalar processors are very common. In the 90s and till the early 2000s, those were the rage actually. I mean, those were kind of the biggest trends. Unfortunately, with time, people realize that they consume a lot of power, and there are many other issues also. Designing of superscalar processors is quite complicated. They will be taught in detail in your HPCA course, and when you first study them, it will be, I mean, your head will spin basically. That, I mean, just understanding what is going on is complicated, and then trying to implement that in hardware, even how that is done, how is it possible to implement such complicated logic in hardware, is just beyond imagination actually. But anyways, it has been done since the early 90s, so of course the technology exists. But before that, we will study pipelining, and in your HPCA course, you will study superscalar processors, where superscalar processors themselves, every execution unit is then pipeline. So it's a combination of multiple execution units where every execution unit is pipeline. Along with that, nowadays you have multi-core processors. So in each of your processors that you have on your laptop or desktop, there are 4 cores, 8 cores. Servers might have 16 cores. GPUs have thousands of cores. So that is the third level. Okay. So this kind of parallelism is, it just keeps on increasing. Support for parallelism. Now there are two very interesting instructions called SLT and SLTI, and we will finish with this today. SLT is set if less than. Okay, how does it work? It compares two contents of two register values RS and RT in an 2's complement fashion. Means the contents of RS and RT are interpreted to be 2's complement numbers. They are compared. If RS is smaller than RT, then RD is set to 1, else RD is set to 0. This is exactly the C if else code corresponding to what the SLT instruction does. RD is kind of the destination register or the result register, what you want to say. Okay. Set, from your digital logic switching circuits background, you know set means forcibly changing the state of a flip-flop to 1, and reset means forcibly changing its state to 0. So here also exactly the same thing. If the smaller than comparison succeeds, you change the register to 1. 1 means only one bit will be 1. Not all bits will be 1. The destination register, only the one bit will be 1 in the LSB, remaining bits will remain 0. But it is guaranteed to have the constant value 1. If the comparison fails, that is RS is not smaller than RT, in that case the register is reset and all its bits become 0. Remember, RD is a 32-bit register, it's not a 1-bit quantity. Okay. SLTI is similar to SLT, just that the second operand is now a constant. Again, it operates in a 2's complement interpretation fashion. You compare the content of the register RS with a constant. If the comparison succeeds and RS is smaller than the constant, then the register RT is set. That is, it is set to the numerical value 1. Okay, plus 1. Else RT is completely reset. Fine. Now they can be used in combination with BQ and BNE. So say for example, you want to execute the code if $S1 smaller than $S2, go to L. This is the code you want to execute. So what you do, directly you do not have any way to combine this goto and comparison together. There is no single instruction in MIPS that will let you do it. However, you can write 2 instructions. In the first instruction, you first perform the comparison. If the comparison succeeds, then T0 will become 1. Okay. So the next instruction you perform is a branch not equal, and you compare T0 with $0, which is 0. If the branch is not equal, if the values are not equal to 0, which means T0 has been set to 1, must have been set to 1, you branch to L. Okay. So please, another small piece of another misconception that I have seen among students in previous classes. They think that if the comparison fails, RD will keep on containing the whatever value it contained earlier, which might be anything, any junk value. No. The SLT and SLTI instructions are deterministic with respect to what values RD will contain. RD, either if the comparison succeeds, will be 1, or it will be forced to go to 0. It is not that it will be left in an some junk state if the comparison fails. That does not happen. So it's a well-defined one state or one value or 0 value that is imposed on RD, depending on whether the comparison has succeeded or not. Okay. So this is slide number 34. We will continue with the lectures in the Thursday class, and I will also give you a small demo of running SPIM programs. And in those of you who are in the lab, student discussion forum channel has been opened in the Teams course page, in the Teams page. Okay. So you can post your questions there so that everybody can, all students have access to it, all teachers and TAs have access to it, so that all of us can access it and we can discuss these questions. Thank you. I'm stopping the recording.